Welcome to the Temple Israel of New Rochelle Oral History Project. My name is Arthur Ostrov, and I welcome Nancy Gavrin to be interviewed for this program. The date is July 15th, 2019, and we are both participating in the recording of this archive at Temple Israel of New Rochelle. The interviewee, Nancy Gavrin, has agreed to and signed the interviewer and interviewee release dated March 1st, 2019. With the formalities completed, let's begin the interview. Okay, so we'll start with where you were born.
I was born in Brooklyn.
Okay.
Both of my parents grew up in Brooklyn. Both went to elementary and high school there and decided to settle there. Most of the family lived in Brooklyn at the time.
Okay. And tell us a little about your childhood. Was it a happy time for you?
I would say so.
Okay.
Definitely. I have one sister who's 4.5 years younger than I. We did move to New Rochelle in 1943, so I was, count the numbers, 6.5 when we moved here.
Okay. And I know that you've been involved with Temple Israel for quite some time, but before we get into your life at Temple Israel, maybe a little bit about your relationship with your parents or grandparents, and what do you remember of them?
Sure. My father's family had immigrated from Russia, from Kishinev, in the early 1900s. My dad came as a baby, a little less than a year old. His father had come the previous year, 1906, I believe, 1905, excuse me, and then his mother and 6 children and his mother's sister, a younger sister, came over separately and came to Brooklyn. They settled there on Eastern Parkway, and that is where Dad grew up.
And on your mother's side?
On my mother's side, my grandfather was born in New York. My grandmother had come as a young girl from Germany, and her family as well settled in Brooklyn.
Okay, very interesting. And how about your relationship with your younger sister? How was that?
That's a work in progress.
Okay.
No, we're fine. We have very different personalities. We did a lot of probably squabbling as little girls, but we grew up in a very happy environment. And she has lived for more than 40 years now in San Francisco, so we don't see each other more than probably twice a year we manage. And she has raised her girls there and has a family unit of 2 daughters and 4 grandchildren there. Our family is a little more spread out. We have a son who lives in Indianapolis and 2 daughters who live in New England. So we have maintained good, close family relationships.
Very nice. How about your relationship with your grandparents, going back to your childhood or earlier days?
I'll begin again with my paternal grandmother, who had immigrated and really was an old world person, I would say. She had a hard life coming from Kishinev. She had a large family. Her husband passed away just during the First World War, 1918, and the family couldn't afford to send the kids to college. One of my father's brothers did go to college, but the rest did not. They all went to work as teenagers, and that was their life. She spoke very little English. We visited her in Brooklyn regularly, but it was difficult to communicate with her. We didn't really have a strong relationship because she really maintained her old world ways, I would say. Sweet person, but hard to communicate with. My grandparents on my mother's side were modern Americans, and we we saw them regularly. We visited in New Rochelle. My mother had 4 sisters, one of whom passed away as a child, but it was a more congenial family unit, I would say. And we saw that side of the grandparents regularly, and summer vacation, etc.
And where did you go to school? At both in grade school and then subsequently?
When we moved to New Rochelle, I had been to kindergarten in Brooklyn, and then we moved here. And I started at Roosevelt School in New Rochelle, on to Albert Leonard Junior High School, which was in the building that is now City Hall in New Rochelle. Everyone is familiar with that. And then New Rochelle High School. Then I went to college in Boston at Simmons College.
And I think you told me during your high school years you were a what? A majorette?
Oh, a majorette.
Right.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
High school years I look back on as a fun time, a good social time. And yes, I have good memories and some friends still from my high school days.
My gosh.
And yeah, New Rochelle was a wonderful place to grow up. I have friends now who come from the city and from other parts of the country, certainly, and when I tell them stories about how wonderful New Rochelle was in the 40s and 50s, they're a little envious, and they always marvel at how we have retained friendships and connections, and always talk in a positive vein about those years.
That's nice, yeah. Were there any teachers that had a particularly strong influence on you at that time?
I would not say so, no. I would not say so. I enjoyed the school environment, as I said, and the social life. I was not a great student, I was a good student, but there wasn't any particular teacher in the high school years that stands out in memory.
Did you go on to college?
I did. I went to Simmons College.
Okay. And
There, many professors still in my memory as very special and wonderful. I majored in graphic design with a minor in Spanish, and after graduation I worked as a book designer in Boston.
Oh. And tell us a little about your college life in terms of were you a sorority girl or
We
anything
did not
like-
have sororities.
Mhm.
Simmons is a small school. It has just changed its name 2 or 3 months ago from Simmons College to Simmons University,
Oh.
because it has had from the beginning several very successful graduate departments. The undergraduate school, which is still single sex, is about 1,800 students. The graduate schools, I don't have a number, but much, much larger. Schools in library science, in physical therapy, in middle management business for women particularly. Probably 6 or 8 different departments. And so they are now truly a university. But yes, it's a school on physically on the border between Boston and Brookline, so it's not, if you picture NYU or something, it's not mid-city, it's a little bit on the outskirts, but it's definitely advantageous to be there. You know, there are thousands of students in Boston on every level. It's a very, though it's an old city, it's a very young city because of the population of so many college and university students there. Great place to go to school.
Yeah.
Great place to visit nowadays.
Yeah, that's nice. And do you get back for reunions?
I do. Every 5 years I have gone.
Oh.
And we have one daughter who lives in Lexington, so that gives us another incentive to go.
Thinking about your life in New Rochelle and how you met David, Maybe you could tell us a little about that.
Sure. I met at a junior society meeting on a Sunday night when I was in high school. I was 15 at the time, and David was a senior in high school. He was president of junior society, so he was a big deal. And they had a square dance on that particular night. Yes, I went, I'm sure, with friends, met David at that time, and it took him a few months thereafter to call and ask for a date. But yes, we started to date when I was a sophomore in high school and he was a senior. We dated for just about a year, and then we didn't see each other except because we had mutual friends here in New Rochelle. We'd meet occasionally on a school vacation or a family event. My parents knew his and yours, and we reconnected when I was again a sophomore in college, and he came up to Boston to visit.
Tell us a little about your earlier days at Temple Israel, when you first started to attend religious school, etc.
I recall that I started in third grade. I'm not absolutely certain about that fact, but yes. And talk about teachers who were memorable. I can't think of one.
I'll bet you remember one person from those
I
days.
remember Mrs. Bragman, of course, as we all do. And I think most of us went to Sunday school under duress. It wasn't fun, but we did it. We were well behaved. We did what our parents told us to do, and we knew we had to go. Excuse me a sec. I don't want to.
We can we'll do editing.
Okay, good. Sorry about that.
Did you went through confirmation? Did you not?
I did.
And graduation or not?
No, not post-confirmation. David did actually, but I was confirmed, and that was it.
And those were the days when everything was at Webster, correct?
Correct. Yes, and married by Rabbi Shankman.
Okay. And a little about your married life and what
Well,
David.
we were married when I was still in college, and David was in the Army. That was the days of the draft, and he was drafted for 2 years in the winter of 1957. So he had his basic training at Fort Dix in New Jersey, and that was probably a period of 8 weeks or so. We were married in June of 1957 and lived by then he had been assigned to the Army Chemical Center in Edgewood, Maryland. So after we were married and had our honeymoon, we moved to the Army base in Maryland over the summer. It's pretty hot in Maryland over the summer, as you know.
And humid.
But I was about to enter my senior year in the fall, and my mom, who was a person with strong opinions in a quiet way, said to me, "You have gone this far, you've had 3 years of college, and I know you well enough to know that if you stop now and give it up, years later you will regret that decision. So it's up to you, but we'd like to see you finish." And that's really all she needed to say. She didn't say, "You have to," or "You must." And in September, I went back to Boston. David moved back onto the Army base, and through someone that we knew, actually someone from the temple, he was able to get a transfer to Natick, Massachusetts, which is just outside of Boston. And as of January 1st of 58, we got an apartment in Boston, and he commuted out to Natick, and I finished my senior year at college. Then we stayed an additional year because he still had months to go in his Army term, and that's the point where I was working as a book designer in Boston for an educational publisher.
Do you enjoy that work?
Loved it, loved it.
And then,
Carried me through to what my career ultimately became, in a way.
oh, that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us a bit about that career development
Okay.
then.
Yes, I was a graphic arts or graphic design major, which was one of the departments at Simmons. At that time, since most of communication was called publications, it was the paper word, the printed word, it was the School of Publications at Simmons. Fast forward a bit, it became the School of Communications as radio and TV began to take over, and I think it's still communications, but of course there are all kinds of offshoots in these days as we have moved into technology over the years. So I did study design and worked as an editor. The publisher mostly published educational materials, that is, textbooks, workbooks, map books, etc. Being a book designer does not mean an illustrator. That's something different. But a book designer decides what the front of the chapter looks like, whether information goes in a box or an insert, or is printed in red or black or italics or plain. All of the technical decisions having to do with print involves book design. And then ultimately, when we left Boston and moved back here and had children, I took on the work similar in PTA work particularly, and always did the bulletins, the newsletters, etc., because they knew I had that background. And that followed me through. Ultimately, when I went into becoming an exercise instructor, I did all the print work for our exercise program, the brochures, etc.
When you were working up in Boston, did you work on any books that are of renown that you can recall?
No, because they were textbooks mostly. They did series of, let's say, social studies books that were on the elementary school and middle school grade. I didn't do anything of a high school level, but it would be a series of, we probably all remember them, geography books, Africa, Europe, Asia, etc., and the complementary workbooks that went with them.
Okay. I haven't gotten into a little more about your parents and grandparents, about what they were like. Can it back up a little bit and you tell us a little about them?
My father, I would say, was a very sociable, outgoing person. As you know, probably, he was a stockbroker. He was a networker before we knew the word networker, or before we applied it to social situations. I would say he was very likable. He was attractive, and he attracted people. And nowadays, even, people remark, "Oh, I remember your dad so well. He was so friendly. He was so outgoing." Mom was a quieter person, very capable. Both were very involved with the temple. He was on so many committees, I think, from the early days all the way through. Mark Sandler, my dad, the membership committee, this committee, that committee, so much so that occasionally my mom used to say, "You spend more time at the temple than you do at home with the family." But she was sort of half kidding, because I think she was proud of the work he did here, and he loved it. He just loved the interaction with your dad, Jim Eppinger, Matt Emanuel, uh, Marvin Fine, etc., etc. You know all those names as well as I do. So yes, he was the more social of the two.
Those names are all on the plaque at the entrance of this building too, because
Yes,
they were all deeply involved with the construction.
exactly.
Yeah.
Mom was very involved with the sisterhood, particularly, and very involved here. Maybe my love and interest in graphics came from her side of the family. She and her sisters were all artistic in one way or another, and she frequently did something that really was little known and little recognized. But whenever there was a particular celebration here for a Friday night, she did illuminated lettering on a sign, usually, that would announce at the entrance to the reception something, a biblical quote or something,
Oh,
etc. I don't know what else to call it. I think it was called illuminated lettering. Very artistic, very attractive. I don't know what happened to all of them over the
I'm
years.
trying to recall whether I remember any of that. I don't think I do.
It was, as I said, little recognized, but she worked hard on it and was pleased with her work. Also, she had been a dancer, and so her involvement with the temple, and this goes back to Webster days, they had rented space in some of the classrooms, actually just across the hall from Mrs. Bragman's office, a double classroom where a dance teacher from the outside, not from within the temple, taught ballet and tap to children. And since she had been a dance teacher in her early married days, she took on the job of kind of being an overseer, not really an assistant, but an overseer for the dance program. And we had a dance studio in our home on the third floor in New Rochelle, and girls used to come over and practice.
I think Carol was part of that at one time.
She probably
not?
was,
Yeah.
and maybe Janice too.
And you, after you were married, whereabouts did you live?
Well, our first year and a half was in Boston, and then in the winter of 1959, we moved back to Scarsdale to an apartment on Garth Road. David was in business with his dad at the time in New Rochelle.
Tell us a little about that.
Yeah, David is the oldest of three sons. I think his dad anticipated that all of them would go into the business. Only one of them did. And he worked with his dad for several years. And then, because the printing unions were very powerful, there was a lot of upheaval. And ultimately, the business was, let's say, put out of business by the unions, and the business was actually sold. At that point in 1963, yes, we moved to Dayton, Ohio, and David became the assistant to the president of the company that bought Gavrin Press, the business.
Right. I always remember thinking Gavrin Press. It was the two names, correct?
It
It wasn't
just by
even,
coincidence.
yeah, because it sounded
Yes.
like it.
Yes.
It had like a double entendre.
Yes. David's mother's maiden name is Press, and yes, it did have a double entendre, but it's just because it was a printing business.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us a little bit about David's career then, and how that.
Well, we did live in Dayton, 1963 to mid-1964. We determined that although he enjoyed his job, I would say, we determined that Dayton was not going to be a home for us. I was particularly unhappy. We had left both of our families on both sides, all of our friends, and Dayton honestly did not have very much to offer culturally and otherwise, and David was about to be 30, I think. Yes, at that point, yes, exactly. And we decided we would come back to New York and resettle. So he made a complete career switch and went downtown and joined Burnham and Company. And he was in the mergers and acquisitions end of the business. He was not a stockbroker.
So, but he went into Burnham, where your dad was also.
Yes, Dad was a partner
Right.
at that firm
Mm-hmm.
at that time. Mm-hmm.
So he's an early M&A guy.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm. His brothers, by the way, live out of town. One brother in New Hampshire, and the other now in Colorado. He lived many years in Florida, but moved probably 10 years ago or so to Colorado.
Okay. You want to tell us a little about your children and their
Sure.
family?
Mm-hmm. Our son Andrew is the oldest, and he has been living in Indianapolis, Carmel, Indiana, which is a suburb of Indianapolis, for about 23, 24 years now. He's a physics professor, has an undergraduate degree from MIT, which is where he met his wife, Laurie. After MIT, they went together to graduate school at Johns Hopkins, and Andy pursued a master's and a PhD, and then did postdoctoral work in the Washington area, generally speaking, in a couple of the agencies there. Laurie, in the meantime, also had a master's. She's an engineer, but then went to University of Maryland and has an MBA as well, so they are lots of, loaded with degrees.
Well degreed.
Let's say. So he took a job in Indianapolis at the combined campus in Indianapolis of Indiana U, Purdue U, Indianapolis. So it's known locally, particularly as IUPUI. A mouthful. He has of late been the head of the physics department as well. He does not love the administrative work as much as he does love the teaching.
Very typical.
But because of other personnel changes in the department, he finds himself putting out fires, shall we say, and doing more administrative work than he'd like to be doing. But they have a very nice life out there, and it is a lovely city. So they have enjoyed that. They have a daughter, Miranda, our eldest granddaughter, who is also an MIT graduate, now working for Google in Pittsburgh, and was married last year. Married a fellow that she met in high school, actually. They started to date when she was, this sounds familiar, 14, and he was 17.
Well, Lauren had the same kind of relationship.
Yes.
Started very early.
Miranda has a younger brother, Dan, who's just entering his senior year at Drexel University in Philadelphia, studying product design. Our daughter Beth lives in Lexington, which I may have mentioned, and she has a daughter, Sarah, who is entering her senior year at Hamilton College, and Ben, Sarah's younger brother, is just beginning his sophomore year at Hobart William Smith, so they're about an hour and a half away from each other in that beautiful, beautiful part of New York State. Our youngest daughter, Beth, I should mention, is a 5th grade teacher in Lexington. She has a master's degree in landscape architecture, which she pursued for a while, and then decided she really wanted something more regular and went back for a master's degree to my alma mater, Simmons, and has a master's in education now, and as I said, is a teacher. Meredith is our younger daughter, and she and her husband Greg live in New Haven. They have 3 children: Elijah, a senior in high school now, Caleb, just starting middle school, and Mia, a daughter, who is in 6th grade as of September. Meredith and Greg started a magnet school for the city of New Haven 15 years ago. It's known as New Haven Academy. They took on a 9th grade 15 years ago, and the following year added another 9th grade until they had a full high school of 4 years.
Wow.
And it has been up and running.
So it's a private school?
No, it's a public school for the city of New Haven, funded by the state and the city. Yes, public school. Lots of hard work. New Haven is not an easy place, and they have done extremely well and have really made a major contribution, I would say, to the city of New Haven, and have been well recognized for it.
Very nice. I'm going to jump around a little bit, I guess. Anything that you can particularly remember about your grandparents going back to? I remember when we had our earlier meeting, you took out a book that gave some details about your family going back quite a ways.
Let me see. Yes, I did. 2 years ago, when we had a special anniversary, I made 4 albums. One for my mother's side of the family, going generations back, as you said. The other for the Sandler side of the family. And another album just for our unit, David's and mine, and our children and grandchildren. And the 4th one to celebrate our wedding, because it was our 60th anniversary 2 years ago. I had a wonderful time putting together the albums and amassing all the documents and the history, and my mother was a great saver, and therefore she had supplied me with a lot of materials that I was able to then use in the albums, which was fun. Other than what I mentioned about my father's mother, Rachel Sandler, whom I didn't really know very well because of circumstances, and then my grandparents on the Stern side, my mother's side, whom I did know very well and grew up with, though my grandmother passed away when I was 10, and my grandfather when I was 15, I would say. We had lots of years of good times and lots of visits and interesting times together.
Did they ever give you information about the family history at that time? Do you recall any discussions of what their early life was?
Again, beginning with my father's side, because he had a difficult and unhappy childhood, coming as an immigrant family and poor and not much education available and hard work and difficult times. At any time that my sister or I would ask him, tell us about holidays in your family, or tell us about going to school or growing up, he would put us off by saying, I don't want to talk about it. It was too painful. It would be too painful. It was too hard. Don't ask me. And so he was not at all apt to reveal anything to us, much to our sadness and dismay, because it would have enlightened us. And going back and looking at some of these records, you realize how tough it was. I didn't tell you this before, Arthur, but on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of Grandmother Sandler, Rachel, and her 6 children and her younger sister coming through Ellis Island in 1905, June 1905, my sister and our first cousins, the children of the other Sandlers, went to Ellis Island on the day of 100 years later, and had a little family gathering. Not a celebration, I wouldn't say, but we all bemoaned the fact that we had not had an opportunity to know our grandmother better, and our grandfather not at all. He died in 1918. And we talked about her courage and her fortitude, and imagine leaving what is now Moldova, the town of Kishinev, which was a major pogrom location, how much we owed to her, and how we never had the opportunity to recognize that in our growing up years.
Yeah. Think about your grandparents and what they went through in their lives. And,
Now, they were the only, that branch was the only ones who I would say really suffered hardship, and we didn't on either side lose anyone in the Holocaust. My grandfather was born in New York in 1869. My grandfather, Sigmund Stern. My grandmother, Bertha Stern, had come from Germany. I think she was about a young teenager, I would say, but I never had the sense that it was a hardship case.
So they established themselves before the turn of the 19th to the 20th century.
Yes.
Yeah. What did they do? What was their his profession? Sig Stern?
He was a stockbroker. He went to high school in New York, and went to work as a teenager as a runner, and worked his way up to ultimately becoming a partner in a couple of different firms. No background in education whatsoever, but very together as a person, I would say, and did extremely well. Had a good career. My grandmother, of course, was a homemaker with 5 little girls.
Okay, well, yeah, maybe a little more about your relationship to Temple Israel and the rabbis and
Okay, through the years and up to now. When we moved back to Scarsdale from Boston, we determined that this was the temple that we wanted to join, and then as the years went by and we had children who became Sunday school age, and living in Scarsdale, most of their friends, of course, went to other temples in the Scarsdale White Plains area. We determined that because we both still had 2 sets of parents here, the Sandlers and the Gavrins, that this was our temple and we would stay. As our kids got a little older, it was a little hard for them not to be in religious school with the kids that they saw during the week in school, and we did hear a few complaints over the years, but so be it. That was
Lauren and I had the same experience.
Yes.
You're
Being
both
outsiders.
nodding.
Yeah.
Both outside of New Rochelle residents and same issues.
Exactly. So you know it well, but we hung on and we stayed with it, and all 3 of our children, Andy, Beth, and Mary, were all confirmed here. I don't think any of them either went on for post-confirmation, but they all were confirmed. No bar or bat mitzvah, but confirmation for all. And and here we are all these years later. David and I have not been involved in the temple, I wouldn't say. We come certainly on the High Holy Days. I come for yard sites for my 2 parents. David chooses not to. He's less of a group-involved person, generally speaking, than I am. I feel great comfort in the tradition of being here. When I sit here and think of your family and all of the other people that I have known over the years here, it really makes me feel warm and good. and I don't know if you were here the evening of, yes, you were, Warren, because that's why we're here today. We spoke as representatives of 60 years of membership. I think that was back in March. And I
We were
said,
still in Florida then, yeah.
and I said at that time, yes, it's a place to call home, and it does make me feel good, and I'm happy about having the tradition of being here. I'm not a committee person, and I have not been involved in any of the workings of whatever, but yes.
You didn't carry on the tradition of your dad and mother in terms of involvement at the time.
I did not.
Yeah.
I did not.
But you did, you and David just recently dedicated.
We're about to
Or,
in August.
oh, okay, but
Mm-hmm.
you tell us all about that and how that came about.
Okay. David's father passed away in 1967, quite young, 63. And
Leukemia, I believe.
yes, shortly thereafter, we decided to create some kind of a small memorial to him, and we decided on a little garden outside. David's father also was not a real temple goer participant. He was a questioner, I'll call him. And yet we decided to do that. So more than 50 years have gone by since he died, and in
63, yeah.
yes, he died in 1967.
67.
So 2 years ago, in 2017, I said, it's been 50 years, and that garden out there is looking pretty disreputable. We really need to do something about it. So one thing and another, you put things off and you don't get around to it and so forth. So unfortunately, 2 years have gone by since that time. But last year we decided to do a garden. So we did speak with Anita, and the garden is in place. It's looking very, very lovely. Recently we added a gazebo and some benches, and our family on the Gavrin side is gathering on August 17th just for a little very informal, I guess you'd have to call it a dedication, with a plaque which is on order, and we're referring to it as the Tina and Arthur Meditation Garden.
Oh, lovely. Very nice.
Mhm.
Very nice. Warren, do you have any thoughts on
Well, I shouldn't be questioning. It's your job, but I want to thank Nancy. It's been lovely listening to this. I think it's an oral history, obviously, that we now have a history. Unfortunately, we don't have a history from some of your grandparents that wouldn't discuss these things, but now this is a history that your children and grandchildren will be able to see. Maybe you've discussed part of it, maybe not, but now it's going to be here forever. It'll be archived at the temple, and it'll be able to be accessed by anybody, whether they live in Indianapolis or San Francisco,
Yes.
or in Lexington, Massachusetts. So that'll be a wonderful thing
I
to
think
leave.
it's a great idea.
And we thank you for participating.
My
Thank you very
pleasure.
much. And
My
my pleasure
pleasure.
to
Okay.
do the interviewing and
Nice to get to know you
learn
both.
some more.